Hello again, everybody. Today we're continuing on with Chapter 5 of Kansas history, and we're going to be talking about all the different groups that migrated here to Kansas. This new land that had opened up for settlement, this brand new state, people wanted to take advantage of all this free land. Well, not free, but open land. And after the Civil War, like we've talked, the population in Kansas greatly increased. Settlers came from Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and even African Americans came to Kansas from the South. And the big question here is why? Basically, people were wanting new opportunities. They were wanting new land. They were wanting a fresh start after the Civil War. And Kansas government and local businesses were actually recruiting new people to come here. They were inviting people to come to our state. The government helped out with this by creating the Homestead Act of 1862. Basically, a homestead is when someone is settling on or farming land that once belonged to the government. So, by the government opening up Kansas for homesteading, it was allowing people to settle on this land that once belonged to the government. Basically, with this, people could gain land at little to no cost to them. Anyone who was over 21, who was a citizen or planning to become one, could claim up to 160 acres, a good chunk of land to get a life and get a farm started. Only thing was they had to pay a $10 fee and actually live and farm on the land. Easy enough. After 5 years, if improvements had been shown to the land, meaning that they were farming, they were being successful, they were actually living there, the government would actually just give you the land. If you didn't want to wait the 5 years and have the government check to make sure that you were actually farming and living the land, you could buy the land early for $1.25 an acre. A real bargain. But that attracted a lot of people here to Kansas because a lot of people were coming here for the great farmland and for the great opportunities. And a $10 fee and living on the land for 5 years, showing improvement to the land, great deal. There were also tenant farmers who came to Kansas. Farming was expensive. If you didn't have the money saved up, it could cost you anywhere from $500 to $1,000 to start up a farm. Basically tools, seed, animals, building supplies, etc. It wasn't a cheap venture. Still isn't today. But when homesteaders tried to get a go in farming and they failed, some of them would start tenant farming to begin with. Tenant farming is a system where you could rent a plot of land and a house from a landowner and just grow crops on that little plot of land. It helped people save money, and they would eventually be able to buy their own land. Some other ways that people could get land here in Kansas. There was the Preemption Act. This was an act that allowed people to live on public land and buy up to 160 acres after just 14 months of living there. There was the Timber Culture Act. This was where people could claim up to 160 extra acres if they would plant trees on their land. Planting trees was a big thing because it would help with erosion. Big gusty Kansas winds would come up and take away the very productive, fertile topsoil, and the trees would help ease some of that erosion and wouldn't take away as much of the good land. So that was also a big perk. Also, people could buy land through auctions and it'd go to the highest bidder, or the government would sell the land for $1.25 an acre if it wasn't sold in auction. So if there's a chunk of land you had your eye on, but you didn't really want to wait, you didn't really want to actually go to the auction, spend extra money on it. If it didn't sell, the government would eventually sell it for $1.25 an acre. But the Kansas population grew by 1 million people in the 25 years' time after the Civil War, which was a huge boom. Another group that migrated here were African Americans. After the South, slaves were freed. After the Civil War, slaves were free from the South, and they migrated north and west for a better life and a new life and better opportunities. Um, so some important amendments that were made after the Civil War to the U.S. Constitution. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery in the U.S. The 14th Amendment created equal and civil rights to African Americans, basically, so they were treated the same as whites. And then 15th Amendment allowed African Americans, at this time, African American males, to vote. However, all these changes, the freedoms that they were getting, they were still facing discrimination. Very few of them had the money to buy land, and they had to tenant farm to save money in order to get their own land. Whites in the South resented the emancipation, the freedom of the slaves, and violence toward African Americans continued to occur, even though they were free and U.S. citizens. So a lot of African Americans wanted to get out of the South for a better life. So Kansas became a perfect place for people to move. So African Americans began moving to Kansas, and they started several black settlements. Nicodemus is a settlement in central and western Kansas, still around today. It's actually a historic site, but it was named for a slave who bought his own freedom. And the people who moved to Nicodemus, they were trying to make a go of farming. They came across some hard times. They actually, when they arrived to Nicodemus, they arrived too late in the season to plant their crops. So they had trouble being successful with farming right off. It was quite a ways from other settlements. So that was kind of a hardship for them to be that far away from other people. And our weather was a little bit different than the South. The South had warm-ish weather year round, very humid. Our winters are nothing like the southern winters. So not being used to the Kansas plains definitely did not help them at all. Another group of African Americans from the Deep South called Exodusters. They were named for the Egyptian Exodus from Bible story times. But an exodus is just a mass migration of people, typically of a religious or ethnic group. So this group of people from the Deep South, they were having an exodus from the South, and they were traveling up the Mississippi. They were stranded, no place to go. They settled where they could find work, and the town of Nicodemus welcomed them in. A former slave named Benjamin Pap Singleton was a land speculator, a promoter. He was one of those people who would buy up land and try and make a profit, try and encourage people to live in an area, buy his land. But he encouraged people to come to Nicodemus, and he worked for changes for African Americans. He was trying to help his people. Some push and pull factors when we studied geography. Back first semester, we talked a lot about push and pull factors. Push factors are things that push people away from their homes, make people want to leave. Pull factors are things that pull people in, make people want to come there. So some push factors that push people away from their homelands: political instability, famine, not enough food to eat, social inequality like the African Americans were facing in the South. Pull factors, things that were bringing people into a new area like Kansas, religious freedoms, lots of economic opportunities. And then the railroad also brought people in, not only to work on the railroads, but to work for the railroads. But a couple vocab words that go along here. Chain migration is migration that's caused by stories of people who have already immigrated. So let's say that your brother and his family moved to Kansas from back east. They are starting a successful farm, doing well, and they write letters telling you stories about their success. They make it sound really appealing in Kansas. Well, You want a new start as well for your family. So you load up your family and you move to Kansas. That's chain migration. You hear success stories from other people and you want to follow their success. Pacifists, another vocab word. Pacifists are people who believe that war and violence is wrong and they refuse to participate. So people maybe in other countries or other parts of the country who don't want anything to do with war, they're peaceful people. They might move to an area that they feel they can get a fresh start and not have to deal with war. Kansas was a refuge for some people like that. For example, lots of different immigrant groups from around the world ended up migrating here to Kansas. People from Germany, Britain, France, Sweden, Ireland, Italy, Lebanon, Mexico, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, all these countries from Europe and Asia, they came here for a variety of reasons. One was bigotry, which a bigotry is a strong dislike of a specific group of people, often racial reasons. For example, French settlers, they were avoiding bigotry in their country and they wanted a tolerance of views. So a lot of French people moved here to Kansas. People were wanting a communal sense. They wanted to feel a sense of belonging and feel that they shared the same characteristics of people of their community. De Beaugier, a French settler, he wanted this kind of settlement. So he helped draw in French settlements or French settlers. Famine, which is an extreme lack of food or people don't have enough to eat. The Irish potato famine was going on in the late 1800s. People moved to the United States and then on into the United States into Kansas for these fresh starts. Just a handful of reasons why people would come here to our state. And that is the end of lesson 2. Just a little bit about how and why people were moving to our state. We'll get into the railroad and the big businesses of Kansas in the next lesson. And remember, if you guys have questions on anything as you're going through the lessons, please reach out, call, text, email, Zoom, whatever. Get in contact with me and I will help you out the best I can. Have a great day, everyone.